the main verdict of the election, as I saw it, was the demise of the ruling party, yet they're still in power.
Yeah.
And this is a victory for democracy.
yeah, it's crazy.
Is net zero achievable?
Yeah, short answer is no.
I'm spending an increasing amount of time on Substack. It has some great content and a wide variety of perspectives, something that is valuable for any investor seeking non-consensus views and opinions. A recent favourite of mine has been the Brawl Street Journal, a source that posts on second-order thinking on Europe's markets, energy, and the collision between regulation and reality. The man behind this blog holds a PhD in international economic law, with a background in World Trade Organization, remember them, dispute settlements, with an international law firm. He also advised banking clients on sanctions law following Russia's invasion of Crimea. He then worked in various economic and regulatory roles in Germany's civil service, giving him a front row seat on how subsidies, regulations, and political priorities work in practice. The Brawl Street Journal was launched last year, helping investors question the consensus, which its creator believes has been infiltrated by propaganda, as defined by the French sociologist Jacques Ellul, who wrote a book of that name in the 1960s. We discuss how propaganda is often an emergent phenomenon of often well-intentioned people, and not just the simplistic, malign, authoritarian means of control we might envisage. We discuss how net zero has become one of several propaganda myths of the established European consensus that have weakened the EU and wider European economies. We also discuss the potential for a net zero-induced crisis, similar to the global financial crisis, and what the prospects might be for Europe to avoid this outcome. But as always, what you're about to hear is not any kind of advice, but for your information and hopefully entertainment. Please take personal financial advice before investing a penny of your money in these crazy markets. With that, please enjoy my conversation with the maverick behind the Brawl Street Journal.
Brought to you by Progressive Equity.
Brawlster, hi. Thanks for joining me. Can we start just with a bit of background on you and what was your path to starting the Brawl Street Journal?
Thanks for having me, Jeremy. I used to work as an attorney in a big international law firm and later in the public sector in Germany, mostly on projects that touched upon EU economic policy one way or the other. And what I kept noticing was that there's this gap. There isn't a lot of media that highlights the fundamentals missing from many economic and policy decisions. At least for Europe, that doesn't really exist. But most European outlets, they're either cheerleading EU policy or they don't dig deep enough. That brought me to writing this Brawl Street Journal because, like I said, I saw this gap in the market and I thought I might have the skills and the competency to fill that. And a lot of the EU's biggest missteps show up in energy. So that was kind of the obvious focus for the Brawl Street Journal. And actually, I've also spent enough time inside what I call the net zero industrial complex to see how investors, banks, and policymakers, they rarely question the fundamentals if that stuff actually makes sense in the long run. But if you ignore those fundamentals, then you eventually hit this brick wall of reality. My goal with the Brawl Street Journal is to challenge these false assumptions in a way that's useful for investors and professionals, for people who need clarity on Europe's direction and the kind of honesty that they won't hear from the big outlets and from the European institutions.
Your writing basically looks at the collision between regulation and reality from an European and EU perspective. How would you sort of frame the overarching problems facing Europe today?
I think you can boil down the problems to three. So the first and the biggest is the net zero dogma. Europe still chasing climate targets at any cost, and that's gutting competitiveness. So energy or electricity is more expensive here than almost anywhere else, and that's driving investments and industry elsewhere. And the second point is that regulation puts a brake on growth. So Brussels has this bizarre idea that you can legislate yourself into becoming a force in AI, for example, or any other sector just by writing endless rules. But every time you do that, you make the EU less attractive as a place to innovate and invest. And the third, to some extent unappreciated problem is that there's this growing political backlash against Brussels trying to meddle in everything. And so the resistance is growing among the population. And there's this danger that if you get rid of the EU, it doesn't just kill the overreach, it also tears down the good parts, like the internal market, that actually made Europe stronger in the first place. So to put it all together, you can say that Europe is living off its fundamentals right now. It's wearing down its industrial base, the budgets are stretching thinner, and issues like migration, which pile more strain on public finances and public stability, they create a continent that's eroding its foundations.
You've referred several times in your writing to the works of Jacques Ellul, someone I'd never heard of before, and in particular a book he wrote called Propaganda, which I haven't read, but I've read about. Can you just give us an overview of his thesis and why it resonates with you?
He provides a framework or pattern that really fits neatly into today's dynamics in politics and also in how social media works and how public opinion gets formed. So Jacques Ellul's main work is, like you mentioned, Propaganda, which came out in 1962. So he describes propaganda as a technique built on human tendencies, on desires and conditioning. And modern propaganda feeds on the structure of the mass and the individual's need for affirmation. So he says man is most easily deceived by propaganda when he's alone in the mass. So the interesting thing is that he says propaganda doesn't create something out of nothing. It always uses pre-existing material, like the beliefs or currents that a society already has. And I think you can already apply this stuff to today's myths, like the rules-based order is one myth, or net zero, or green transition as economic strength, or Russia as pure evil.
Or strength in diversity.
Another super interesting aspect he mentions is that propaganda isn't really about changing one's opinion or belief. It's about making people act. So he argues the real aim is action, not belief. And by doing that, you make people cling to a certain course of action. And over time, those actions shape attitudes.
Yes.
So it's action first, belief second. So in his day, actions would have been attending a rally, for example, or protest. And today it can be likes or shares on social media. And so you have all these micro commitments that add up until you vote for a certain party or until you're happy that your electricity bill gets higher.
Yes.
That leads us to the next question, which is how do you trigger those actions? And that's with emotion. You don't get people to act with a balanced thesis. Too many facts confuse people, and confused people don't act. And that's what narrows the corridor of things you tell people.
So you appeal to their emotion.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. And that drives us to do things like sort our rubbish into recyclable and non-recyclable stuff, even though it probably all goes in the same tip at the end of the process.
Exactly.
Action leads to, we feel emotionally good about the task of what we're undertaking.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Which might lead to a societal benefit, but it might not.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And so that also tells you that propaganda isn't just for totalitarian states.
And it's not necessarily deterministically malign. It can evolve in ways that are unintended.
Exactly.
And being reinforced in ways that have unintended consequences.
Yes. So as opposed to like Bernays, who also wrote about propaganda, Lil says that it's kind of an emergent phenomenon. So we all kind of contribute to propaganda. There has to be no central ministry or anything like that. It just emerges from how we all behave and how political parties act to get voted and then later to justify their policies once they are in power. So people actually think they're doing something good. I mean, for example, you put a solar panel on your rooftop or your balcony and you think you're helping the climate, but all you do is make the grid more, you have the grid stability. So these myths, they are these emotionally charged frameworks to interpret reality.
Yes.
And today, democracy itself is becoming this myth too. And it leads to the result that anyone who's opposing certain policies looks like they're opposing democracy itself.
It does seem to tend towards a state where everybody is also categorized as good or evil. And if you question one aspect of the derived propaganda, you question all of it and you become anti-democratic as a result.
Exactly. So the dynamics that are the end result of this emergent phenomenon, this division of good and evil, because you cannot bear ambiguity under the system, you need to have these clear-cut answers, and then you have this kind of feedback loop that sharpens the discourse in that sense, and it leads to the end result you just described. But of course, this kind of dynamics kills democracy, because democracy is messy and it means debate.
And it requires freedom of thought and freedom of speech.
Yeah, exactly. And listening to the other side without branding them as evil just because they disagree with certain topics.
Have you read the book, The Coddling of the American Mind?
No, I haven't.
It's Jonathan Haidt
right.
and Greg, I think his name is Luganioff. They're both American academics. It's essentially an explainer written about 10 years ago about the demise of free speech on American campuses. It sort of explains the culture of cancelling seen across universities, certainly in the UK and in the US, and I would imagine elsewhere as well.
Yeah, I mean, that totally aligns with this entire postmodern idea that there's no absolute truth and no objectivity.
Yes.
And as long as you belong to the victim group, then your subjective emotions or evaluations, what has happened, are the only ones that are valid. It's entirely crazy if you think about what that means. So there are even politicians in Germany that say, for example, when it comes to sexual offenses, that the burden of proof should be reversed. It shouldn't be in dubio pro reo. It shouldn't be that the state has to prove the guilt of the offender, but in such cases that the offender or the suspect has to prove its innocence. But how do you do that?
Specifically in your work, you've covered Germany's deindustrialization. Is this reversible? And if so, how do you do it?
I mean, it's a self-inflicted wound, and in theory, at least, it is probably still reversible. So the first step is to phase out renewable subsidies, because these are just a transfer of wealth from productive sectors to an unproductive sector. The second step would be to reverse the exit from nuclear power and to get back on a policy that's based on abundance and cost of energy and not on climate virtue. And at the EU level, Germany should push back against policies that hand industries arbitrary targets, like net zero goals in the auto industry. The EU sets CO2 caps for automakers, and these caps, they are fleet-wide emissions average. And the result is that German car makers, they still sell their profitable SUVs and luxury sedans, but sprinkle in just enough low-emission cars or electric cars to balance the numbers. So that means the margins are still in the big cars, not in the small ones. And instead of making affordable EVs for the mass market, they double down on those premium cars while adding just enough token EVs. And who fills the gap? It's the Chinese.
Meanwhile, BYD is trying to flood the world with its ultra-cheap EVs.
Exactly. And German manufacturers, they are the losers in these disruptions because the incentives are stacked against them. And that's what this kind of central planning leads to. It distorts incentives, and you end up with products that meet certain targets, but hand your market to competitors.
So it's a direct function of energy policy.
Yeah.
What is the likelihood of this type of energy policy reversal being implemented in any form of sort of foreseeable future?
I think it's zero, or at least close to zero. Maybe if there's another snap election and totally new government forms, then that's a different story. But right now, you have Chancellor Merz, and he has no leverage over the coalition partner, which is the left-center SPD. So in fact, he has the conservatives by the throat, and they are fully committed to net zero, renewables, and so on.
It's a remarkable version of democracy. But as a result of the refusal to engage with the AfD, the SPD, the main verdict of the election, as I saw it, was the demise of the ruling party, yet they're still in power.
Yeah.
And this is a victory for democracy.
yeah, it's crazy.
Please explain.
So the thing is, right after the election, even before the new parliament was formed, Merz broke his biggest campaign promise, the no new debt.
Yes, in quite a spectacular way.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally undemocratic to use the last days of the old parliament to push through this amendment, because they knew with the new votings that wouldn't have the majority. As a result, it gutted his credibility with his conservative base. He will never get elected again. So if there was another snap election, he would lose.
I think I read somewhere that he's even more unpopular in Germany than Keir Starmer is in the UK. But
yeah, it sounds reasonable.
If a replacement for Merz was elected tomorrow, his or her hand would be essentially controlled by the policies within Brussels.
If you think about net zero, you can see in France that I think they even stopped issuing new permits for solar and wind this year. So you can go the nuclear route. It's also carbon free, and it's just the political will and, of course, the money that you have to spend. But arguably, the amount of subsidies that flow into renewables might as well flow into nuclear.
Yeah. The decision to close German nuclear reactors, which in a typical German fashion were some of the most efficiently and best operated nukes in the world. I cannot believe that money or favours didn't change hands in order for that policy to be put in place.
So, I mean, the Green Party, who was in power back then, and the economic minister, he was a Green. So he ultimately decided to shut down nuclear plants during the biggest energy crisis Germany has ever seen. And the founding myth of the Green Party is to be opposed to nuclear power. So, and they still cheer that this was the right thing to do, even though Germany now burns more coal than it did before. So it makes no sense at all. But you can see again how propaganda...
It comes down to propaganda. Is net zero achievable?
Yeah, short answer is no.
Okay, move on.
So if you look at the numbers, CO2 emissions, the world emits almost 38 billion tons and Europe emits just 2.5 billion. So it's just 1/15 of all its CO2 emissions. So even if Europe stopped burning fossil fuels tomorrow, it wouldn't make a difference. And I assume it wouldn't change much about the most catastrophic projections. If those projections do come true, then you need capital to adapt. You probably want to build dams and desalination facilities, things like that.
You'll probably need AI to try and help us solve the problem. And to get AI, you need cheap and plentiful energy.
Exactly. Google just backed up from building a new data center near Berlin. And I think Facebook wanted to build one near Frankfurt, but figured they couldn't get a grid connection. So you just waste a ton of capital on something that's not even helpful. And if these projections don't come true, then they weren't necessary in the first place.
You wrote a really interesting piece a couple of months ago. I think it was following the blackout in Iberia, Spain and Portugal, where you made the comparison between Europe's chosen green energy policies to the sort of risks of the world economy prior to the GFC, the global financial crisis. Could you just elaborate on that a bit? And I thought it was really interesting.
So the similarity to the financial crisis and the grid is essentially non-linearity. So a non-linear system behaves one way at a small scale and completely different at a large one. So the example I gave in the piece is that a bank holding 100,000 mortgages is hard to model. But if you bundle millions of them into opaque securities, sell them on margin, and layer them on the global system, you create this exponential unpredictability. And a few bad loans can spiral into global collapse. And so essentially the grid works the same way. Its components don't respond in neat proportions. So small changes can trigger disproportionate and unpredictable effects. And the more renewables you add, the worse it gets. And it's really counterintuitive because a single solar panel or a single turbine looks really simple and it's easy to understand how it works. But if you scale them up, then the system stops acting intuitively. So with fossil fuels, with coal and nuclear and also hydropower, you have spinning masses that deliver inertia, which essentially is kind of a shock absorber that levels out those spikes that could spiral into unpredictable results that can knock out an entire grid like we saw in Spain.
So they behave more like an equity layer in a financial system that can absorb the shocks.
I got a few comments on this piece, and people pointed to South Australia as a counterexample because it already runs on 75% renewables, mostly solar, and they want to get to 100% in a few years. And they haven't had a blackout so far. But the thing is, South Australia is just 1.8 million people living there. In Germany, you have 83 or 84, and in Europe, you have 450 million. So again, it doesn't scale linearly. What works for less than 2 million people will probably not work for 450 million people.
So where are the wider risks in Europe?
It could become a problem. So Germany's Federal Network Agency, a few months ago, they put out a decision that essentially warned more or less from a continent-wide blackout. So they said there isn't enough inertia in Germany. France probably helped to stop the blackout in Spain from spreading because of the spinning masses in their nuclear plants. So essentially France seems to be the shock absorber for Germany and Spain.
Interesting,
in some sense. And that also shows you the absurdity of the energy transition, because if every country does that, then the system will collapse. Germany couldn't run on such a high renewable penetration if it wouldn't have its neighbors that don't.
Interesting you use the word energy transition because it reminded me of propaganda, because in factual terms, it's an energy addition, not an energy transition.
Yeah, right. Good point.
I don't know whether that's right, but I'm pretty sure that the world, on a global level, we haven't even reached peak firewood yet.
Yeah,
we're still consuming more coal year on year, and we're definitely consuming more oil. I mean, okay, the rates have changed, maybe slowing down, but the energy transition is an energy addition so far.
Yeah, absolutely.
Looks as though it's going to be for some time to come.
Yeah, you have breakthrough in fusion.
Yes.
Which is always a decade out.
Yes, yeah, indeed. Is Europe destined to just permanently be caught sort of geopolitically and economically between the US and China?
It certainly looks like this today, but I think if you zoom out, then the answer is no. If you look back to the 15th century, Portugal was a really small country, like less than 1 million people living there, but they became a global superpower thanks to the lateen sail, which lets ships tack against the wind, unlike square sails that only catch wind from behind. So this technology made Portuguese a global empire because they could venture far into the Atlantic and around Africa. And my point is you only need the right ideas and the right attitude to become strong. And by that measure, Europe is not doomed to be caught between US and China. At least in theory, it has the knowledge, the engineers, and even the resources to become much more independent in energy. I believe Europe isn't trapped between America and China. It's trapped in its own bad ideas.
We need to change the propaganda.
Yeah. So it's weak by choice, essentially.
Yeah. But as we stand today, I mean, we've just had this event in Alaska only a few days ago, really, discussing the future borders of Europe without any presence of any of the European leaders there.
The thing is, most of Europe's leaders, they keep repeating these unrealistic maximalist positions.
Yes.
And that's how you set yourself up for failure. Ukraine can't win this war militarily. NATO Secretary Rutte even says that Russia outproduces all NATO countries by a factor of 4. And at the end of the day, Russia is a nuclear power. So I guess there will be a deal that will end up with Europe bearing the financial brunt for any security guarantees, for example. That again ties back into a little Russia. Putin is framed as the absolute evil. He can only be defeated by force. And also having this common enemy is excellent political glue. So it really puts the lid on all the other problems Europe has. And at the same time, that stops you from trying to understand Putin's position. So the invasion by Napoleon and Hitler, it may play a role in Russia's collective memory. And you don't have to agree with that. And of course, it doesn't justify the war. But if you don't even try to understand your opponent, you can't find common ground to reach a settlement.
And of course, the hypocrisy in all this is that Europe collectively is still buying a lot of its energy from Russia one way or the other. Is there a future where Russia becomes Europe's filling station again?
So we've seen how US companies try to buy essentially the Nord Stream pipeline in the insolvency proceedings. And who knows? So Europe has pledged to buy 750 billion worth of US energy, not just natural gas, also nuclear tech and so on. So Trump could essentially put a US company in as an intermediary, rebrand Russian gas as something like Liberty Gas, and then twist Europe's arm to buy Siberian gas again.
And he'll take his customary 15 or 20%, depending on what he can get away with, no doubt.
Right, exactly. So, I mean, the reality is that these hydrocarbons are stranded in Russia. If there were a market for them, they would be price negative. And at the same time, Europe needs them. So if you strip away the current political posturing, it almost looks inevitable.
As you say, Brussels has committed, seemingly, to buying huge quantities of US LNG. They're going to direct European utilities and energy buyers where they're going to be buying their energy from in future?
It's really hard to force them. So really the only mechanism is subsidies. And once you use subsidies, then you signal to the market, oh, they have to buy from this market, and that will spike prices. So that's actually what happened earlier this year when Germany got scared it wouldn't hit its storage targets. And so the Ministry of Energy or Economics, they suggested we can subsidize these LNG purchases. And immediately the prices for summer LNG spiked and were more expensive than winter LNG, which doesn't make a lot of sense. But you can see how the market immediately jumps in on these opportunities. So maybe the idea of Trump rebranding isn't that crazy after all.
Liberty Gas.
Yeah.
Just a recurring observation I have looking at the world today is if you go back to 2001 when we were told by our leaders then as to why this would be a good thing, was that if we trade with them, it'll make China more like us. It'll turn them into a liberal democracy. Whereas if you look at where we've come in the last 25 years, whether it's in Europe or in the US under this sort of national capitalism, we're more like them.
I mean, it worked, just not the way, just in the opposite direction.
But of course, we talk about Europe as if it's sort of one market, one economy, which obviously that's the case in the world of propaganda, but it's not. And you've written about it, and it's observable that, Central and Eastern Europe and the Baltic states are very different to Western Europe. I remember you writing about Poland being the new industrial powerhouse of Europe. What's going on here, and what can the rest of us learn from what's happening in Central and Eastern Europe?
So, first of all, it probably boils down back to not being that crazy about net zero as Germany is, for example, and being open to nuclear. Another aspect is probably that Eastern Europe, after decades of central planning, may simply have a different relationship with rules coming from a central organ. You have to remember that member states, they do have some leeway in how they implement European rules, at least in some respect. And Eastern Europe has often pushed these limits. Hungary, for example, has stretched state aid rules to attract big projects like battery gigafactories and auto plants from China. And the gamble is that Brussels won't punish job creation. And so far, that seems to work. And also, if you apply these rules too strictly, like Germany, you suffocate industry. And so there might be more of a willingness to bend these rules for growth. Whereas the West, at least the German instinct, as far as I can tell, is to regulate to the latter and slow things down in the process.
Yeah, the Hungarian, Chinese gigafactories and EV plants that are going in must put it on a bit of a collision course with Brussels, I would have thought, and must be a very tricky problem to negotiate in terms of finalizing and evolving trade terms with the Trump administration.
I mean, it gets really messy. So earlier this year, there was this limit or cap on AI chips that the US would impose on exports. And they singled out a couple of European member states like Portugal, Poland, Hungary, I believe. And at first glance, it didn't make sense why these member states and not others, like Germany wasn't singled out. And then when you look at this list of countries, they all engage in China's Belt and Road Initiative.
Right. Okay.
So it's kind of obvious. Somehow no one mentioned it anywhere in the media. But if you compare the two lists,
it comes back to propaganda, because not just why or how, indeed, could the US impose different terms in different geographical regions, otherwise known as countries, in this one big, beautiful, free and open market that is the EU.
Yeah, exactly. If the EU would be abolished tomorrow, then it's not like you'd have 27 fiefdoms that would put up their trade barriers, I guess. Yes. I mean, that's obviously one of the big achievements of the European Union. But again, it developed into this sprawling bureaucracy that keeps suffocating the host, if you will.
What are the prospects for this sort of mind shift in ideology within the EU and our European leaders? How does it happen? Is it ugly, or can it happen smoothly?
I don't think that political leaders really do perform a mind shift. They just need to be replaced with someone who has a different opinion on things. So essentially you would need some Millet type of character that has the guts to take on these ruling circles, but also this intellectual depth to explain why change is needed.
He really is, in my humble opinion, the shining light for the West. And I think it's imperative for all of us that he succeeds in what he's doing.
I agree. And it's really interesting how when he came into power, the media, they reported a lot.
Far right.
Yeah, and they they talked about him, but yes. Now hardly anyone talks about him in the media. So that kind of suggests that
he's doing okay. And it looks as though the Argentine economy is going to grow somewhere between 5 and 6% this year, which, okay, a low base, but he's doing it.
Right. And probably what you can infer from that for Europe is that things have to get much worse until people realize that this path is unsustainable.
So for the time being, we're going to go through more collectivist, authoritarian control mechanisms from our political leaders. And one of the areas that you've written about in this is the whole area of programmable money and central bank digital currencies. How do you see that playing out in Europe?
So the ECB's justification for a digital euro is that if enough people adapt private payment systems like stable coins, you get that lock-in effect that can't be unwound, even if it's harmful for the public good. So they argue the central bank needs to act early. But you again have the contrast between the US and Europe. The US has banned a ban on CBDCs and is instead moving towards a market-based stablecoin solution. So Europe believes centralized control is somehow better. I think the idea of programmable money, this is something dangerous. It's not a new idea. And
it'll make payments so much easier. The user interface will be so easy, and it'll be safe. It'll be low risk. Sure, what's wrong with that?
Yeah, and of course, even if today's leaders have the best intentions, the problem is what happens tomorrow. Once you have that technical capability, you have an incredibly powerful tool of control to whoever comes next. It feels like Christine Lagarde, she wants to leave this legacy of the euro becoming a world reserve currency or whatever. But if you have this conditionality or these programmable features in there that eventually you want to spend the money, and if you need this off-ramp, and if this off-ramp is somehow compromised, then this lack of trust, it seeps into the trust of the entire currency. So it really has the potential to backfire.
As ever, the UK is part of Europe, but not in Europe. The audience here is largely a UK one. What are your thoughts about the UK in that predicament from a sort of more holistic economic political perspective?
I think in theory, this position should give the UK real flexibility because it doesn't have to accept every new rule from Brussels. It could use that freedom to attract investment and to ease regulatory burdens. But maybe I'm wrong, but it feels like they're still trying to mirror Brussels instead of breaking away. They have the freedom, but they don't use it. So the UK does have an edge in energy with the North Sea, and it isn't trapped by the EU-level frameworks. And all of this could be a competitive advantage, but it seems like the political choices that tend to squander it.
Do you see the EU as being able to adapt, or do you think it's going to come to an end?
I think it's definitely at a crossroads. So either it reforms in a serious way or it risks collapsing in the next few years. So Brexit has already shown how fragile this all can be once enough voters feel alienated. And of course, the bad thing is if the system breaks, then you don't just lose the excess bureaucracy, you also lose the good parts that keep Europe prosperous and at peace. And you can see across the continent that anti-EU parties rise. And the chance of France electing an anti-EU president in 2 years isn't zero. So definitely the discontent is growing.
I thought it was just amazing. I didn't watch the whole thing, but the clips that I saw of European leaders sitting around the table with Donald Trump this week. But Merz, Starmer, Macron, I mean, they're all this on different lengths of borrowed time.
Yeah, and the contrast is really stark how they talk and behave their home countries. And so that's where the propaganda breaks down when you see pictures like that.
Thank you for the conversation. I've enjoyed it immensely. Thank you for writing the Brawl Street Journal, which I read each of your articles with great interest when they come out. What are your ambitions for the Brawl Street Journal?
So essentially, I see it not just as a publication, but as a business. And right now the focus is growth. So that's why everything is free. I want people to share it widely without any friction, and putting content behind the paywall too early would only slow down that growth. So long term, the goal is to turn BSJ into a full-time project. And that means adding a paid tier that's kind of escalating. So more frequency, maybe deeper dives and formats that don't make sense to do in the free version. Exactly what that looks like will evolve, but the idea is that the paid side gives more to readers who want to go deeper.
I wish you all the best because I think you're doing a great job in helping people understand some of the absurdities that are going on in our world and how we should think about it more rationally, which I think is essential as an investor, but also as someone who just wants to try and understand a bit better each day how the world works. So you've really added to that in terms of what I read, and I look forward to following your ideas and thoughts as the Brawl Street Journal continues to grow. So thank you.
Thanks for the invite. It was great fun.
Brought to you by Progressive Equity.